If I think about what my two earliest memories are, and I'm never really sure which one was the first, but I think either of them could have happened when I was about 2 or 3 years old. Uh, the first I think I can remember, and it's funny to think of these memories because it's always sort of like my mind was sort of suddenly waking up out of a darkness. But, I remember being driven in my parents' van to this house that had a very sloping sort of driveway, and there was a little boy on the front lawn of this house playing with some dolls and toys, and there was a high chair there that I thought was, a doll's high chair. And I played with him for a while, and I remember thinking that he talked like a little caveman. Um, Turned out that he was, the son of the pastor of the church that I would end up going to as I grew up. But I didn't know this back then. Back then I just thought, oh, he's this angry little boy who's, so upset with me for wanting to put a pillow behind the baby doll that we were playing with when it was sitting in its high chair, and I thought, oh, I'm just making it more comfortable, but he got very angry when I did that, and it's a funny thing to think years later that actually he was technically right, that a lot of people say if you put pillows near a baby it could choke and things like that. And actually, yes, putting a pillow behind a baby in a high chair doesn't really work out. Um, but yeah, I think I remember him angrily telling me that he didn't want to play with me anymore, which was, rough. Given that, I think he was one of the first children I ever played with. And it turned out that he and I were the same age. I don't remember much else about that day, so I'll end that story there. But the second memory that I remember is more challenging. When I was a small child, my mother, I was standing at one of the sort of doorways of the kitchen that is in this house still, and, I was going to touch something with my hand. And, it was this weird situation where my mother was looking right at me, telling me not to touch it. But I was a small child, and I just felt this irrepressible urge to touch whatever she was telling me not to touch. I can't remember what it was now. But, I just couldn't resist it, even though I consciously wanted to obey her. I found my hand moving towards it anyway. And, she looked like she was about to angrily pounce upon me. And, but my father was sort of standing behind me and a little ways off, and when he saw her nearly pounce upon me, he grabbed me, and he rushed me out of the house, and he drove me up to the nearest shopping center, and we sat there for a while, and he began to basically explain to me that she was mentally ill. But, of course, being a small child, I couldn't understand what he meant. And he didn't directly use the term mentally ill, but he said that, he was trying to tell me that the way she was behaving towards me was wrong. That she was, he didn't use the words excessive anger, and I remember, because I was small, and, in that moment, I can remember absolutely trusting her. Absolutely trusting her to be just in her punishment of me, and finding it utterly mystifying that my father would try to protect me from her, and thinking, and I remember arguing with him and saying, but I was going to touch the thing that she told me not to touch, and he said, still, even then, it's not okay. And, eventually he got me to talk to my mother on a payphone, and she yeah, her voice sounded utterly crazy. It was the sort of voice a woman has when she's actually really, really sad and distressed, but she's trying to sound happy. I think because she wanted, and I can't remember exactly what she said. It was something along the lines of, I love you, and I want you to come home. And, as the years went on, I would come to understand that this was a tone of voice she would sometimes bring out in situations that didn't really call for it at all. There was no desperation going on whatsoever. It's just that in her mind there was desperation. and she would, fall into this pattern of behavior. And, eventually, after hanging out at the shops for a while, because, my father explained that he wanted to give her time to calm down and to stop being angry. And, once he felt somewhat confident that this was the case, he drove me home and put me back in the spot where I was standing when she had nearly pounced upon me. And, basically she said, "Are you going to go away ever again?" And he said, "No, I'll never go away again." And, when I was a small child, and for many years after the fact actually, I somehow understood this moment to mean that my father went from caring for me and, being willing to advocate for my health and safety, to not caring, to making the active decision that he was going to sell me away in order to save his marriage, even if it meant, my sickness or death. And, looking back, I know better, but growing up I spent many years understanding that moment to mean that the only real love in the world or in the universe was the love of between a man and his wife, and that no other love really existed or mattered, that it was all just illusion or delusion. And, for a long time, I understood that to mean that I couldn't count on my parents to care about me at all. I understood it to mean that parents didn't love their children at all, that if I ever wanted to be loved and accepted, I had to find a husband. And what it meant was that I started looking for a husband from a very early age. From as early as maybe about 3 or 4, I started looking. And, this message was reinforced by a lot of the, Disney princess movies I watched as a kid, and, but I'll get more into that later when I talk about, my early childhood years. Right now, I want to focus on, I think, ages 2 to 5. 2 to 5 should be about right. What else can I remember from this phase of my life? One of the other moments of, my conscience rising up, out of the murky unconscious, was a moment where my parents were asking me questions about whether or not I wanted to go to kindergarten, which was a weird thing my mother did. She asked me whether or not I wanted to go to kindergarten, and then later on whether or not I wanted to go to school, as if I had a say. I think it's worse to ask your child as if they have a choice when, even if they say no, you're still going to make them. It's better to, I think, explain to them why these things are necessary, and then just ask them to be cooperative. But, anyway, I remember them, filling out this massive envelope full of forms, and then, taking it up to where my kindergarten was at the time. I remember it being a very dreary, dark, rainy day. Like, it almost seemed like night. It was that dark and rainy. And, that kindergarten was a significant place to me. I mean, at first I was nervous and fearful of being left there because my mother had, planted ideas about stranger danger in my head pretty much as soon as, she was able to talk to me and have me understand. And, so my first day at kindergarten, I was a bit apprehensive, but I wasn't one of the kids who cried. I wasn't one of the kids who cried when their parents left. I just sort of went in there, and while I can't remember very much about exactly what happened that day, I remember I had an immense amount of fun. So much fun that when it was time to go home, I didn't really want to. I went to grab my coat and I think maybe a little bag I had off of a peg that was on the wall with all the others, and, when my mom came back to get me, and, but after that first day, things at kindergarten were not that simple at all. the woman who ran the place and one other woman who worked there, you know, one was really, really aggressive and the other was really kind. And, yeah, the aggressive one I often frustrated by wanting to play the same games or songs over and over again, even though she would say, no, it's time to move on. She would become bizarrely angry with me, which, struck me as odd. Well, it strikes me as odd now, but back then, being a little kid, I didn't know that that was a weird way of behaving. But the thing that really got me in trouble in kindergarten was that there was this boy who was bigger than the rest of us by enough for me to think that he was maybe a year or two older than the rest of us. And because he looked very similar to the irritable, the irritable teacher, and because she seemed to give him preferential treatment even though he would bully the other kids, and she in fact she tended to turn a blind eye when he would bully people, I came to think that he was probably her son. And, when she'd hear me saying this, she would get very angry at me. Yeah, because, she just gave him so much preferential treatment. And again, why was he so much bigger than the rest of us and bullying us and getting away with it? It didn't make sense. Any other kid who would bully another kid or do some other naughty thing would get time out. But not him, he would get to just sort of sit in a nice fun chair doing some fun activity. And so I came to feel that the only way to stop him from bullying the other kids was to fight him, to start yelling at him. And so I regularly did go up to him and start yelling at him. And, every time I did it, and the teacher would catch me, she'd obviously hear me yelling, and you would feel the air, I would feel the air in the room change. It was like suddenly the air became hard and heavy, and she would come up to me and she would tower over me, and I'd be this tiny little creature, and it would feel like the earth was shaking. I would feel just terror in every part of my body, while she would scream and shout at me, telling me, look at me, and I couldn't bring myself to look at her face, because, of course, if you're raised in Asian culture, you can't look at your parents when they're yelling at you. If you look at them when they're yelling at you, they just yell at you even louder. And whereas, I guess it's been explained to me that Western people are different, that if you don't look them in the eye when they're angry with you, they actually get angrier. So, but I just couldn't bring myself to look this woman directly in the face when she was angry at me. And, the kinder teacher used to take pity upon me and defend me. And I used to say, I won't do it again, pleading for my life, basically, because I felt like I was dying under that pressure. And every time I said it, I meant it wholeheartedly. I really believed that the yelling I had done at that bully would mean he would never bully again, that he would behave himself. Just as I fully intended to never yell at him again, on that proviso, because the teacher, especially because the teacher was yelling at me. Like, I genuinely, wholeheartedly believed it. But, yeah, no, what would happen was the boy would bully the other kids again, the teachers would let him get away with it again, and I would become angry with him and want to bully him again as revenge. And I would get punished again. And this went on for, a few times until eventually the kinder teacher turned on me as well and said, well, and the first teacher, the meaner one, was like, yeah, we're not going to let you get away with this. No one is going to rescue you this time, And, yeah, I'm getting more upset than I expected to, because this was actually an incident that I really had to work through. throughout my life. Very hard to be okay with it. And for years afterwards, I felt like if I ever saw those teachers again, I would just slap them. I would just scream and hurl abuse upon them and tell them what horrible people they are and how wrong it was of them to want to exact such power over such a small child, you know? But it's very easy for me to say that, you know? I don't know what it's like to have to work in early childcare, and I imagine having to be in charge of, what, like 15 small children would be a very challenging career, and, you know, I imagine that, you know, it would be very frustrating and hard to maintain one's temper, and it has to be understood that this was the early 90s. It was, something like 1992, 93, and so of course, you know, people didn't know what they know now about kids, and back then people thought the best answer was a harsh one. And yeah, no one bothered to really talk to me and ask me what was going on with me, and why I was doing what I was doing, or to help me better understand the situation. It was just yelling. And, you know, I don't remember any of the other kids in the kindergarten being yelled at this way either. It was pretty much always me, and it seemed like the really naughty kids were always just either getting timeouts or just flat out getting away with their behavior. Years later, when I told my mother about this, the conclusion she drew was that the teacher must have simply been racist, because as far as she could tell, you know, all of the kids in the class were white, except for, you know, maybe a few stray exceptions, and even then, the kids who were the stray exceptions all had white names. So my mother concluded that the teacher must have been a racist and had deliberately left out, you know, kids who were not from Western backgrounds. You know, I don't know the truth of this. Oh, I'm not telling everything that happened in that kindergarten. You know, there were times when we would be taken to this special place where we would be taught about how to ride bikes. For some reason, I always got stuck with a bike where the pedals were so tight that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push them. And, you know, the teacher would yell at me for not being able to push the pedals and move along like the other kids, but it was the hardest bike to pedal, and somehow I kept on ending up with it. And, I think it didn't even have training wheels. You know, there'd be these other kids there who would be racing along on these tricycles just fine, and I'd be stuck on this bike that was just way too advanced for such a small child, but yeah, and, yeah, it was just like that. It was like I was just constantly being yelled at in this place, and, you know, for a long time I just kept remembering how small and weak and afraid I felt, and how, it very much shaped, I think, my understanding of authority throughout my childhood, in particular, because, you know, it's only pretty recently, actually, in my life where, somebody who I see as being authority over me can yell at me at all, and I won't feel the need to just cower before them, where I'll actually feel capable of talking back for myself if they are actually wrong. When I was younger, to be honest, I hated my teachers for how, unjust and pitiless they sometimes were, and how unfair sometimes they seemed in the kind of power that they would enforce over the students. But I never had the courage to even admit it to myself until I was much older, that I resented them for this. And yeah, I've done a lot of work on myself to recover from all of that, but I feel like this was a powerful shaping incident in my life, and I think it does to some degree still impact me to this very day, and although not as much as it used to. not as much as it used to.